All right, my friends, I think what we'll do is we'll get started and see who joins us. So we've talked on a couple times. Jews used the new opportunities they were given to escape to the cities, to move up to this on the social scale, but essentially until the massive industrialization of the 1930s, many, especially the middle-aged, and especially even more so the elderly, remained in the shtetls and remained in poverty. The Communist Party decided that this group could be helped by driving them towards agriculture, and the entire Jewish community as well, driving them towards the world of agriculture. If you remember the Etsekzi, I'll remind you that that's the group within the Communist Party composed of Jews whose intent it is to bring Jews towards the socialist way of thinking. They welcomed this plan to settle 100,000 Jews on the land, believing that a mass agricultural settlement of Jews would give the Jews the means to subsist, while at the same time provide a basis for socialist instruction in Yiddish. And for the communists, this is in goal. They have this land I'll talk about in a second that is a sparsely populated land. They want to move the Jews out there primarily because it's easier to institute a new farming system in a collective with a group of people who've never been farmers than it is to take people who've owned their own lands and try to shift them into that model. So the Jews are a better vehicle to achieve that. Now, ever since the 19th century, agricultural labor had held a sort of mystique for the Jews of Eastern Europe. Think of the Chalutzim in Israel, ultimately. There's that sense of the new Jew, all right? Many of the Maskilim, the younger enlightened ones, were stirred by visions of Jews abandoning their economically shaky and socially repulsive occupations for the healthy, ennobling farm labor. They were influenced by this romantic idea of the savage, noble savage, who creates Jewish agricultural settlements in Argentina, in North America, and in Palestine. They're looking for places in the world. They've never been able to, the mystique is they've not been able to own land. They haven't been engaged in farming. That's not been part of the Jewish world. So now it's the communist turn to try and create something like that. When the plan gets announced, foreign Jewish organizations familiar with this settlement are attracted to the effort that the Soviet Union is trying to do because they're interested in the economic rehabilitation and the physical survival of fellow Jews. By the mid-1930s, the JDC had put together $13.8 million in work in funds for agricultural work, and another 10.3 million in other assistance. We're talking about $24 million in the 1930s. That is significant money. They aided colonization primarily because they were interested in relieving Jewish poverty, unemployment, but there was another agenda as well. The other agenda, particularly among the Evseksi, was that there would be a creation of a consolidation of the people as a nation. They'd have their own land in this process. Right? They no longer would be landless. That's the charge. That's the struggle the Jews have. They are essentially landless. And it's one of the, I remember from a conversation with the director of Yad Vashem, it was one of the claims that Hitler made. There's no reason for Jews to survive. If you don't have your own land, you have no reason for existence. And so one of the goals here of the Evseksi is to create their own little state within the state. This, from the perspective of the outside world, is one of the most exotic and at the same time controversial attempts to solve what is the Jewish problem. What do we do with this people? They argue ultimately that Jewish ills can only be treated in an independent Jewish state, And in 1927, a mission is sent to survey the area known as Birobidzhan. All right, let me spell that. Let me spell that out for you. Biro, Biro, BID, Birobidzhan, ZHAN, Birobidzhan. And where, just so you have a sense of where it is just north of the China border. It's in the far east corner of Russia. It's about as far away from the Ukraine as you can get. Okay? And it is an area that is relatively unserved, it's unpopulated. It is an area larger than the country of Belgium. Okay, and yet there's only 32,000 people living there. So the communists have several goals here. Number one, they want to deal with the Jews and find them a way in which they can be productive. But they are also concerned that because it's sitting on the border of China and it's underpopulated, they're worried that it is vulnerable to infiltration by Chinese settlers or ultimately Japanese settlers who are also trying to take over Manchuria during this time. And so they want to build settlements there. There's an element I hear of an Israel West Bank. They want to build settlements there to prevent any of the other nations from trying to do so themselves. This idea, as I said to you, meets with great fanfare both in the Soviet Union and abroad. You've got the creation of an agricultural party. An agricultural community is part of the Communist Party's effort to set up a territorial enclave where, and this is critical, a secular Jewish culture rooted in Yiddish and socialist principles could serve as an alternative to the Palestine plan. All right? There's this talk of starting a new nation. There's this talk of leaving Russia. Here, this solves a lot of problems all at once. It deals with the Jews and their poverty. It presents something as an alternative to the Palestine goals, and it settles a land they're worried will be taken over by the Chinese and Japanese. It meets a lot of needs all at once. It's real. And it clearly is meant to undercut the Zionist focus. So, like Jews all over the former Soviet Union, those who ultimately did go to Birobidzhan had to continue wrestling with the problem of Jewish identity, both as an individual and as a community. Who is doing the moving? At the end of the day, it's many of the younger Jews who welcome the Bolshevik rule because these new masters in the Kremlin are promising an end to social and economic inequality. They're offering new employment opportunities, and they're taking a stance against anti-Semitism, which everybody is experiencing. The Bolsheviks profess a commitment to the rights of national and ethno-religious minorities. Cultural diversity is being permitted if, in the words of Stalin, it is national in form and socialist in content. You hear that phrase over and over out of his mouth. Lenin and Stalin, the Bolsheviks' leading theorists, believed excuse me, that socialism ultimately would doom to existence all religions and all nationalist sentiments and loyalties. That's the ultimate goal. All right, they believe in the long run that all cultures would ultimately fuse together and form this common Soviet culture. But until that time, each nation, each ethno-religious group, excuse me, I'm choking here, so I'm not sure what that would be allowed to proceed smoothly, would be allowed to reside in its own traditional settlement, it would be allowed its own culture and its own traditions. Religion's not part of that, though, and that's important. They believed that with the disappearance of religion, if you could remove the religion from the ethno identities, then ultimately there would be a secularization that would lead to full Russification. Think about what that means here in America, too. You take take religion out of Judaism, will it disappear? That's what they were proposing. The Kremlin was also, as I mentioned before, is concerned about the Jews' intensive poverty, the unemployment, the overpopulation, the resurgent anti-Semitism, the vicious pogroms that had taken place in the recent years. And Jews had been particularly hard hit by the collapse of the economy because, remember, during the World War, they were living in the area where the war was being fought. They had similar issues with the revolution. There's civil war, and then there are pogroms. So although the economy is affecting everyone, all the more so the impact on the Jews because of their locations and their lack of land, in a sense. And so the government says, let's encourage Jews to settle the land. The government, therefore, what they're doing is refashioning the occupational profile of the Jews, hoping to transform them into farmers. Now, why? One aspect of this problem of the Jews is that, according to the Soviet officials, the Jews are perceived as unproductive in terms of the economy. Jews are involved in leaseholding and commerce and money lending, and they're regarded as such as parasites who exploit the peasantry. And so the solution to this question depends on transforming the Jews from a harmful and retrograde community, their words, not mine, to one that is incapable of causing social and economic damage. Their attempt is to normalize the Jews, to make them productive like everybody else. By the way, there's also a Zionist objective, that's what we saw as well. But they're looking to take this, integrate the Jews into society in a way that will be productive for the masses in general. The decision, however, to designate this Birobidzhan district as the official territory of Jewish land resettlement is problematic from the very beginning. The summers are hot and rainy. The winters are dry and cold. Sounds to me like St. Louis. Okay? We have extremes, okay? It's rich in the north, it's rich in natural resources, but at the same time, much of it is large tracts of swampland and marshes. Again, sounds a lot like Israel in its early days. And so what made granting Soviet Jews their own territory a special case was that, and why they sent them there, is here is a land in which Jews have no roots whatsoever. Every one of them is starting over. And if you've ever moved to a new community and started over, you realize it's a challenge, and you're far more flexible and far more willing to make changes in your life than you are when you're in your regular routines. So on March 28th, there's a decree that reserves this district for the settlement of only Jews who would work the land. And the government begins encouraging Jews to move to this region. The decree bans agricultural settlement by non-Jews. They're looking to create a Jewish area. And it states that if Jewish settlement is successful, a Jewish administrative national territory entity would be able to be set up. They're looking to create a place for Jews. The dream is realized in 1934 when the district is designated as the Jewish Autonomous Region. Jewish Autonomous Region. I'm going to refer to it as the JAR going forward. So in this Jewish Autonomy Region, the JAR, Birobidzhan is actually the capital city and it becomes a national territory of Soviet Jewry. Now, be aware when I talk about the JAR, and then when I now going forward, I reference Birobidzhan. Birobidzhan not only is a city, but it comes to represent the entire JAR as well. It's like when you say Washington, you can be talking about the entire United States in your reference to Washington. Okay, so Birobidzhan is a common term is used. There are strong incentives that are designed to attract impoverished Jews to Birobidzhan. The government provides the migrants and members of their family with either free or significantly discounted travel and food subsidies. It extends credit to them. It gives them tax exemptions, and it gives them other material benefits. Anybody willing to engage and move there and engage in agriculture would be subsidized in many, many ways. They even say to them, if you go and do this, if you go there and you become productive Soviet citizens who are tilling the land and bringing out food for all, you will regain your electoral rights. So you become full citizens in a sense. So there's a lot of motivations here for people who've been suffering financially, never had land, all sorts of problems that go with it. So what is it the Jews discover when they get to Birobidzhan? Victor Fink, who is a Soviet journalist, accompanies a group of American fundraisers who traveled to Birobidzhan in 1929. And he writes a scathing account of the horrendous conditions that he encountered. He describes the railway station where the vast majority of newly arrived migrants would disembark. And he says the settlers there are living in makeshift barracks that would put prisons to shame. Many families quickly went through their meager food and allocations and loans and were reduced to a state of poverty. And so begging is proliferating in this world, as is Jewish women selling themselves into prostitution. We're talking about a total terrible conditions. Fink concludes that the cause of this disaster is a lack of planning for how to absorb the sudden influx of immigrants, of newcomers. Local officials, he says, were ill prepared to handle the arrival of thousands of Jewish migrants. They were understaffed. They were plagued by inadequate supplies and equipment and poor planning, and the government systems designed to settle Jewish pioneers essentially were not up to task. They had an idea, but they didn't do the legwork. Additionally, the agricultural settlement fell apart because most of the Jews who chose to resettle in the new area chose not to get involved in agriculture. The vast majority of them who came there had little or no firsthand knowledge of farming. And so they were unprepared psychologically, unprepared intellectually, and not sufficiently physically fit to assume the rigorous demands of pioneer life. You've seen the pictures of the Chalutzim in Israel. All right, you've seen suddenly from the poor from the Holocaust with the people underfed and malnourished. You have this picture of the Israeli with the big build doing the farm work and suntanned and looking like an Adonis. That's not who's moving here. Okay, and so they're discovering all the problems that go with that, and it leads to a high dropout rate for the settlers. During the first decade of its existence, approximately 35 to 40,000 Jews move into the region, but most of them choose not to remain. The yearly dropout among Jewish settlers climbed to as much as 50% at one point. Those Jews who do choose to remain were more likely to gravitate not to the farms, but rather to the capital city of Birobidzhan and into the non-agricultural employment fields, That's what they had experience with. It was in their comfort zone. And so you can see with all of these factors in place, it's hard to imagine how the designation of this remote territory, just literally thousands and thousands of miles away, which is unsuitable for agriculture, would serve as a magnet for the impoverished. Add to that the fact, and this is the 1920s when they're planning it, and very late 1929 when they start to move people there. In the 1930s, industrialization hits. All right, and so the Soviet Union has their efforts as a government are now diluted because agrarianization is no longer their major focus. One more piece that made it more difficult. Jews who are moving here assume when you move to Israel, you assumed you work the land. It's like America. If you moved west in the 1800s, they gave you a land grant. Go work the land and you own it. In the Soviet Union, that's not what's being promised. It's a government-owned land that you will get to work and take some of the proceeds from. And the Jews were not happy with that. They wanted to own their land. And as a result of all of these different factors, the plan to resettle a significant number of Jews on this land of Birobidzhan was essentially a stillborn experiment. Despite what I just said, and see people taking notes, I'll give you a chance. Despite what I just said, you have the housing problems and the food problems and inadequate medical and sanitary facilities, all of this, the region does tend to grow, and it becomes an important source of cement and tin and bricks and paper supplies and clothing. The capital city of Birobidzhan, the city itself, grew to about 30,000 inhabitants by the eve of World War II. But what is distinct about that is that it's a large number of non-Jews. Remember, the plan was no non-Jews would be moving there. This would be a Jewish community. And what happened is the local officials became aware of an acute labor problem, and they're just eager to bring people in to populate the region and to work and to work. And as a result, it's not surprising to find that what would be the Jewish region, Gentiles ultimately outnumbered Jews in this land. By 1939, 109,000 people were living in the region, 18,000 were Jews. Basically, less than 20%. Okay. International support. This project, when it's announced, is very well known among world Jewry. Zionists, all right, now Zionists, they're looking for people to move to Israel. They fight the idea. They're not interested in this Birobidzhan. They don't want an alternative to Zionism. However, most prominent Jews outside of the Soviet Union defend the Kremlin's decision. And in various cities in the world, supporters organized committees. They publicized awareness of this region. They raised funds for the project. I told you about significant dollars, and for things even as much as creating the cultural world within, such as newspapers, etc. And so there's an entire worldwide suggestion that this is a good thing. So one of the goals of the Soviet Union initially is to foster a specifically Jewish nature for this new community through the use of, we keep hearing this, Yiddish. Yiddish is the tool. It's intended to serve as the bedrock of a secular, proletarian Soviet Jewish culture and community. As the national language of the Jews, Yiddish, they wanted nothing to do with Hebrew because Hebrew represented Zionists, Hebrew represented rabbis, Hebrew represented everything they were trying to drive away So Yiddish would hew closely to the dictum I mentioned before, national in form and socialist in content. In 1935, the government decreed all documents, including public notices, announcements, posters, and advertisements in Birobidzhan needed to appear in both Yiddish and Russian. This is Russian law. Street signs, railway station signs, postmarks appeared in both Yiddish and Russian. Police and judicial investigations could be conducted in Yiddish if the parties involved were Jewish. The government set up schools, two types of schools in which Yiddish was the language of instruction, that's option one. Two, in the schools in which Russian is the preferred language, Yiddish would become an obligatory subject. A reminder. First of all, I haven't stopped them giving anybody a chance to talk. So let me do that now. Okay. Nobody's jumping out of their seats. I've got it. Remember then. So in this use of the Yiddish, in the political climate of the 30s, writers are nonetheless required to fit their words to the uniform ideology of the regime. Yiddish was permitted, but it had to be using the ideology that they approved. Literary efforts focused on the transformation of Soviet Jews into productive citizens who would labor in the collective state farms and factories that would dot the landscape. That was the vision, and Yiddish was the tool. And it was meant to, in contrast to what they called the stultifying religious environment, the grinding poverty of the shtetl, Birobidzhan would signal the dawn of a new age for Jews, an age in which they could express contempt for Jewish tradition. They could free themselves of their burdens and their limitations and their prejudices of the past and glorify Soviet opportunity and power. The content in the Jewish schools was laden with propaganda and designed to instill feelings of Soviet patriotism. Now, I'm not sure that that's bizarre because I think that's what American schools do too. From day one, what you walk into school on day one and we learn "My country 'tis of thee." And that's not. My point is that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's the norm. But they're making a very deliberate effort to Russify the Jews and take them out of their Jewish world. They simultaneously, combat any kind of religious practices among Jews. At Passover time, a series of lectures and other events are held in factories and they're held in workers' clubs. In other words, they bring the message to the people that with an intent to undercut the appeal of religious Judaism. The lectures covered a range of topics such as the incompatibility of socialism and religion. And moreover, they target specifically women because they see women as the bulwark of religious beliefs and practices within the family itself. So what you've got here is an absence of a synagogue, a prevailing political climate which makes open religious practice very risky, and as a result, in a world in which you've been removed from everything you know in the past, and the result is an anti-religious campaign that experiences some real major success. Yes, Diane.
Is this just going on in this area or is this going out throughout the whole country?
This is primarily in Birobidzhan.
Thank you.
The newspaper accounts reveal the frequency in which anti-Semitism all over Russia is actually rearing its head, but particularly in the region in the 1930s. Generally speaking, so remember, we're talking about a population that was supposed to be all Jews and is now less than 20% Jewish. So generally speaking, the guilty parties were educated Russians and Ukrainians who, after having too much to drink, targeted Jews for anti-Semitic name-calling, Jew-baiting, and at times physical assaults. Echoes of America, unfortunately, as we look today. Often the anti-Semites are looking for a scapegoat and to blame the Jews for the problems of the collective farms they've established and the industrial enterprises. It doesn't, I described for you, none of it goes smoothly. The government is not set up to make this all work. They move the people, they're Jews and non-Jews, but it is very problematic, and a scapegoat is needed. And the Jews happen to be sitting there. Whatever the motivations of the anti-Semites, the Soviet authorities vigorously prosecuted anti-Semitic behavior and showed no leniency. So again, we're talking about a distinction about Jews from Judaism. The Jews, they will protect the government. They're going to rigorously attack anything to do with Judaism. And then everything changed. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin unleashes a series of purges that the inhabitants of the region don't escape from. The purges served several purposes, not the least of which is a consolidation of power for Stalin. Okay? The shakeup of the government and the shakeup of the party personnel signals the end of the Kremlin's efforts to devote significant resources and attention to Birobidzhan. Prominent Kremlin advocates of the Birobidzhan project, of which Stalin had been one, but as he shifted his attitude, he turns to all those who had been advocates at his side, and many of them are imprisoned or executed. You know, to some extent, I think, what you've got is when a new nation is formed, there's a lot of flexibility. And you want to bring people in. And as your power base grows, you want to consolidate power and shift everything. And that's kind of what I see as happening there. By the late 1930s, Stalin's emphasis on Russian patriotism had come to the fore. And policies that had been designated to facilitate cultural expressions fall by the wayside. The state closes almost every Yiddish school in the JAR, as well as elsewhere in the country. The concerted effort to move Jews, to have them migrate, ends. And by the eve of World War II, most non-Soviet observers would conclude that the Birobidzhan project had been an abject failure. You've only got 16% of the Jewish population there, and they never actually built any kind of Jewish community. It is an abject failure. Responsibility for the failure, a large part of it does belong to the Kremlin and to the Soviet government, but not all. As Lucy Davidowitz, who is a famous Jewish historian, notes in her memoir, Yiddish was an insufficient basis on which to maintain one's identity. Reliance on a language alone doesn't safeguard cultural identity, especially when a host of factors undermine the force of the language. Even if the government had taken its commitment more seriously, she says it's likely that the effort to establish a socialist Zion within the borders of the Soviet Union would have failed. Language may be a necessary component, but it's also insufficient. That's her argument. Thoughts, comments? Does any of that relate to modern America or America? I think to the Borscht Belt. There's part of me that's thinking back to the Borscht Belt. My mom in Yiddish was Jewish, meant the same thing to her. But I think it was more than just a language for her. And that's the distinction here. So when we come back, we'll talk about World War II and what went on in Russia. But ironically, post World War II, the trauma of that World War breathed life once again into Birobidzhan. The end of the hostilities in 1945 saw a revival of a Jewish migration to the JAR. Because not only did tens of thousands, I'm sorry? Okay. Not only did tens of thousands of Soviet Jews find themselves displaced by the devastation of the war, but when they returned to their homes, they often faced hostile welcomes from the people who had taken possession of their homes. They weren't welcomed back. And so there's an appeal to try this once again. But by the end of 1948, estimates indicate that, again, as many as 30,000 Jews are now in Birobidzhan. This is post-World War II. Let me do this here. Early 46, there's a council of ministers who announce a plan to once more try not just for Jews to move there, but to in a larger structural system to stimulate the development of the region. The plan focuses on the building of industrial enterprises, the construction of new apartment homes, and it decrees that professionals such as medical doctors and teachers be sent to the region. The government once again offers free transportation. They offer loans. They offer other incentives to those settlers who will come and till the land. And many Jews respond to this appeal, viewing the region now as a land of opportunity after the devastation of the war and a way to escape the war's ravaged conditions that they came back to. Personal loss and a sense of tragedy motivated many of these people to say it's time for a new life in a new region. This all happens at a time in which the Soviet Union, during the war, relaxed internally a lot of its grip on Soviet society. It needed to build camaraderie in a war against a foreign power. And so they relaxed a lot of the kind of rules that Stalin implemented in the late 30s. All that said, so you have all these Jews moving in. In the initial movement, most of the people who moved were secularists by nature. In this world, in the second movement, they were Jews of all ilk. These are people fleeing the experiences of the Holocaust. And so many of them are now bringing their organized religion into this new community, and religion experiences a brief revival. The party officials take one look at this and they express alarm. In 1947, 400 to 500 persons, including army officers and policemen, attend high holiday services. This is not the plan, okay? It's not what they had in mind. The revival comes to an abrupt halt by the end of 1948. What does 1948 represent? Israel. Okay, so now you've got Israel as a competing body for a land of Jews. In 1948, if you've ever read Elie Wiesel's Dawn, not Dawn, his book on the Soviet Jews, he talks about the fact that Golda Meir comes in 1948 in September, right after the state is established. And she comes as a representative. She's the first representative to come to the Soviet Union. And Jews flock to her in huge numbers that the Soviet Union never intended. She went to synagogue on the high holidays. The place was packed. Stalin became infuriated. She herself said, "I'm worried my presence here is going to cause a lot of damage." And it did. There was a sense of perceived political disloyalty once the state of Israel is created. And you then have unrestrained anti-Semitism in response. And Stalin launches a murderous campaign to destroy all Jewish intellectual and cultural activity in the Soviet Union. He attacks them as ruthless cosmopolitans, as bourgeois nationalists, and it culminates in 1953 in what is known as the famous Doctor's Plot. And I'll do a little bit about that later. But essentially, the message, what happened is numerous prominent Jewish physicians are accused of plotting the murder of lead party officials using poison. Stalin's death in 1953 prevents the implementation of a plan to punish all of those doctors. Brezhnev wanted nothing to do with it once he came to power. During this time, all contact between non-Soviet Jewry, Jewry from outside the Soviet Union and Jews in Birobidzhan comes to a halt. It becomes isolated. The government isolates the Jews living there. The Jewish theater is closed. Instruction in Yiddish is forbidden. The synagogue shuts its doors, and in 1956, a building next to the synagogue burned down and took the synagogue with it. The assault of Stalin's last years basically delivered a mortal blow to the experiment known as Birobidzhan. Those Jews who still remained were terrified to express their Jewish identity, and the experiment really never recovers from that. The Jewish life in Birobidzhan essentially becomes sterile. Few visible manifestations. Russification continues, and all education and government business is conducted in Russian, and the government stifles any genuine stirrings of Jewish culture, certainly religion, but culture and language as well. You're going to enjoy this up and down here with me. Mid-1960s, we're now next decade. The Kremlin, seeking to score propaganda points in the international arena, cautiously allows the revival of Jewish cultural activity in Birobidzhan. Radio performances of Yiddish songs and plays, regular form of entertainment. Some religious activities continue. There's no synagogue, it burned down, but Jews continue to meet as a minyan in a wooden shack not far from the synagogue where it had stood. And in addition, they although they outlawed rabbis, there was a cantor in town, and so he kind of led things. Well, they now welcome back into town a shochet. And what does a shochet mean? It means there's going to be kosher food. So you can see some loosening here. Today, what do I say today? 1996. As of 1996, in Birobidzhan, there was a state-supported Jewish day school and 2 Sunday schools in operation. In addition, a variety of formal and informal Jewish organizations sprang up in the early 1990s, ranging from essentially what was a Maccabee sports club to even a Zionist youth group. But it's become very, very non-essential. It's a small group of people living there. That's Birobidzhan. That's the attempt to make Jews into farmers on land that they don't own. That was the attempt to make them productive citizens. And you can see we know by the fact that in 1980s another 2 million got up and left, either to America or to Israel. It didn't work. So I'm open to any comments or questions. Is it? Yes, Manny.
Now, wasn't this in the 30s a period you have the kulaks in a different area doing agriculture but starving to death?
I'm sorry, having the what?
In the Ukraine, the kulaks.
The kulaks?
I think that's what it was. I might be wrong.
I'm not sure who that is. Okay, go ahead.
No, but I think it's more the western part of Russia that Stalin let them all starve to death.
Right, well, in Western Russia, that's exactly the case. And it's one of the reasons some of the Jews living in the Ukraine were so dead set against Birobidzhan is they were worried that Russian dollars would be completely eliminated from the Ukraine and sent elsewhere. And essentially, yes, that's what happened. All right, my friends. Yes, Sandy.
Yeah. Okay, this is a very tiny percentage, though, of the Jewish population of Greater Russia at the time. So what happened to the people who didn't go to Birobidzhan?
Okay, so we're talking about the 1930s. Okay, correct? So you have a sense of what's going to happen in the years in the late 30s in terms of Germany. Germany invades and they get almost as far as Moscow. Okay, and in process, with each town they conquer, they wipe out the Jewish population. So if you ask me what's the big picture and the big numbers, unfortunately, that's the big numbers. Okay, but today there's 500,000 Jews in Russia. So some Jews fled. They fled to Israel. Some Jews fled to America. But by 1924, the gates were primarily closed. It was small numbers who could get in, and the rest, unfortunately, became victims of the Holocaust.
Are there still Jews in Birobidzhan?
Well, I don't know today, but as of 1996, there clearly were. If there's a day school and 2 small religious schools in place in certain clubs, it says to me there's not a lot, but it says to me there's a presence. All right. So happy Hanukkah, Shabbat Shalom, Happy New Year. Okay, lots of joyous things there. And may we come back the week of like something like the 11th. We'll continue on with the experience of the Soviet Jews in World War II.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you all.
much.
Have a wonderful day.
Bye.